Okay, welcome everyone to CBS, Columbia Business School, to our Earth Day event sponsored by the Richman Center for Business, Law, and Public Policy. And we are fortunate to have the ex-dean of Columbia Law School here, David Schizer, who, as lawyers are wont of doing, wrote a book called a law review article. I think it's 90 pages. So given that it's Earth Day, I printed it, double-sided, 2 pages, and it's still book length.
Many trees died.
Many trees for this,
Yes.
but it's worth it. Because this is a conversation about climate, environment, and national security, which are not typically two things mentioned in the same sentence. As far as abstracts go, I think the first sentence here basically says it all. So too often, energy policy protects the environment while neglecting national security, or vice versa. And the goal for the next 45 minutes, an hour, is to try to get to the bottom of how do you combine the priorities, right. Or for that matter, how do we agree where they differ? What's the big idea? Like, what do we do to not always have this be bumping up against each other, but essentially say, look, there are clearly too many other problems in the world, but let's focus on these two first. How do you get off fossil fuels while not exacerbating other problems?
So basically, this is a topic where externalities drive the whole thing, right? We know with a lot of products, you want quality, you want low costs, and of course we need that with energy too, because energy is foundational. It's literally the thing that powers our economy. But the thing that is so important and interesting about energy and makes this hard is that it has huge implications for people who aren't part of your transaction. So if I am selling a form of energy and Gernot is thinking about buying it, the thing is, our transaction is going to have a lot of effects, right? And I think 2 of them are really familiar to everyone here. One is climate externalities. We burn a carbon-based fuel. It increases emissions. That can contribute to global warming. Second is pollution, right? We burn it. There's stuff in the air, bad for our health. It interferes with, lots of issues with that. But my point in the article is, although we understand those, there are 2 others that really we need to think about. And those are externalities having to do with national security. And so one of them is, if we use a source of energy that comes from a country that is not particularly secure, the United States may feel like we need to defend that country. And I think many in this room are too young to remember when Iraq invaded Kuwait back in 1990, before some of you were born. But nevertheless, basically it was well understood at the time. The US and a coalition intervened to defend Kuwait, and there was talk about how we were doing it to defend sovereignty. But there are other invasions where we haven't been motivated to defend sovereignty. This was about the oil, right? This was about the fact that having a potentially hostile power control that energy could be dangerous to the economies of the US and its allies. So the first kind of cost that I want to highlight is what I call defense externalities. There's a country and the supply there is insecure because maybe they're surrounded by potential enemies, they may get conquered. And then there's the second, which you will understand from personal experience more directly. The other externality happens when the supplier of energy is not insecure, but they're themselves a threat. So what was the main supplier? Which country was the main supplier of oil and natural gas to Europe? And the answer is Russia, right? And Russia, basically 45% of the government revenue of Russia, just before it invaded Ukraine, came from energy sales, because there were state-owned companies, heavy taxes. So basically, when German consumers were deciding how warm they wanted their living room to be, their decisions had a direct impact on how powerful a military Russia was going to have. And so I call that funding externalities. And the point is, what we want is we want to figure out how to have an energy policy that works so that our economy hums along, but also is attentive to the needs of the environment and of national security. So that's what we're here to talk about.
Okay, so, and yes, right, Europe is funding both sides of the war,
Yep.
arguably, and, still is.
Yep.
Billion euros a day essentially going to Moscow.
Right.
Okay, so the answer is getting off fossil fuels.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Part of the answer. So basically, my big picture point is there are two things to do, right? One is, as we reduce demand for fuels that have defense and funding externalities, that's good, and that includes fossil fuels, so we look to green sources. But the thing about that is the green sources have analogs. There are also funding and defense externalities there, and I'll come back to that. But the other thing you also should do, in my view, is I don't think it's realistic to expect to wean ourselves off fossil fuel in the next few years. It's 82% of global energy. It has been for a long time. It's a good goal. I'm supportive of it over the long term. But we're going to have fossil fuels, and the point is, as we do that, there are ways to try to focus on sources of fossil fuels that are better for the environment as opposed to worse, and that are more consonant with national security as opposed to more risky. And I'm happy to lay out what I think those are.
Okay, so to be clear, right, so the picture has changed since, I was 10 when
Right.
Iraq invaded Kuwait, so, not quite conscious yet, but yes, living in Europe, prices spike and so on.
Yep.
And by now, the biggest oil producer is not in the Middle East. It happens to be us right here.
Right.
Which clearly, okay, that's part of the national security equation, right? And then the bigger question, I guess, is, okay, this is a economist cover, from petrostate to electrostate, right? There's a lot in there, right?
Yes.
Because, petrostate isn't just bad because it's dependence on oil, but there's a hint at, autocracy here. The electrostate presumably is good because of it's no longer oil, coal, gas, it's now electricity, solar panels, and so on. But the implication is the national security angle. Now you have the funding externality with China, basically.
Yep. So
Is that
more to say.
Okay.
More to
yes.
say. Okay. So first of all, it is, in my opinion, a good thing to try to diversify energy sources, to rely more heavily on electrification when we can. But let's just start with a very basic national security problem with doing that. And I don't want you to hear me as saying, therefore, we shouldn't. The point is, as we do it, we have to be aware of the issue. So let's, I don't know if any of you are quite old enough, back in 2013, the whole Northeast's power got knocked out. There was sort of a problem in Ohio. I would actually become the law school dean the next year. My predecessor, David Lebron, would joke with me that as soon as the lights went out in the law school, everyone's first thought was that it was his fault. But it was actually a power station in Ohio that had this broad effect. So the point is, that was not good, but could we drive our cars places? Yes, we could, right? There was more diversification in power in those days than there will be in a world where our houses are heated by electricity. Still mostly not true. My home has a electric heater because it's green and I care about that. But the point is, when you live in a world where the electric grid supplies not only your refrigerator, the lights in your house, but also your transportation and and all the other needs, you really have to be sure that grid works, right? So terrorist attacks on the grid become more significant. So anyway, just one preliminary point is there's good in electrification. There's also that challenge. And then we can turn to the other externalities in a minute. But
Fair enough. Okay, so two counterpoints, right?
Yep.
Okay, one is batteries, right? And essentially, so you don't just have the Tesla in the garage, you have the Tesla pack, or, not to use brands here, right? You have the electric car, the lithium-ion battery. There are mini grids, there are there's resiliency that is clearly needed, investment in resiliency.
Right.
And the sort of tools we have to electrify also help. Now the second is, so this is, the $1 billion from Europe going to Moscow these days, right? So when that stops, grammar in Europe freezes, right? Actually, literally, my grammar in Europe, right? Because the gas stopped.
Right.
Okay. Let's say China is supplying literally 100% of all batteries, all solar panels, and we no longer want to buy anything from China for some reason, overnight.
Right.
The panels, the batteries installed still work. Grammar doesn't freeze. We are no longer installing more, but there is independence resiliency built in by virtue of not having the commodities flow, but it's a technology we've installed, and that'll still work. That's a fundamental difference, right? And sort of adding resiliency to a system that, while dependent on fossil fuels, doesn't have that sort of resiliency.
So on the other hand, it's not that I fundamentally disagree, but I don't want us to overstate the case. I have solar panels on my home. They actually don't power the whole home, even though my whole roof is completely covered by them, but they don't quite do it.
Fair enough. And you live in New York, so you can't have batteries because the fire department says no batteries in your home.
Right. But I think the point is, if you look at the math of this, the growth of renewable energy is impressive, but it doesn't provide the so-called base load. You need to supplement it with something. As we all have more and more batteries, it becomes a bit less of an issue, but we're not there. We're not even close to there. So you need to have some other source which doesn't vary with the weather. And one possibility, which I think is a good idea, is nuclear, right? Nuclear is not dependent on the weather. For many years, countries have been backing away from it. You're from Germany?
Austria.
Austria, okay, sorry.
As anti-nuclear as Germany, so yes.
All right, because I was
back my
shocked.
Austrian passport if I said anything positive, but...
Right. I was shocked that even as Putin had invaded Ukraine and even as Germany was scrambling to try to figure out what to do, they were still closing nuclear power plants in Germany.
Bad idea, yes.
I think, bad idea. But on the other hand, now that we're back on the subject of security, and also environmental harm, right? Like, you got to do something with that waste.
Yep.
You certainly don't want that waste to be available to people who can then make dirty bombs with it. And by the way, for those of you who followed a particularly scary moment in the Ukraine-Russia war, there's a large nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye. And there was a battle being fought in Zaporozhye. And there were moments when the Russians were kind of shooting at the reactor.
And hit it, turns out.
Hit it.
Yeah.
And at the same, so like, nuclear has its own security issues that need to be addressed. But more fundamentally, the natural partner for renewables at the moment is natural gas. And I'm a fan. I think it's, for now, a very good thing, and the US is a major producer of it. But if we take a look at this question of defense and funding externalities, and you alluded to this, and it's really important that we focus on it. So if we want to get to a point where solar and wind is more than a, fairly modest percentage of the total energy in the US, we're going to need solar panels. We're going to need wind turbines. Most wind turbines that are built on land, US, so that's actually a niche that we are dominating at the moment. Offshore, China.
And, offshore turbines turn whales batty, so we are not installing them for 4 years.
Right, exactly.
There's different topic.
Those challenges. But remember, as you said, like, solar panels are almost all made in China. Batteries have been made in China. It's changing a bit. Sorry, I didn't mean...
It's changing fast. Okay, so my hypothetical was, what if 100%?
Right.
And true, right? So the further down the supply chain you go,
Yep.
98% of polysilicon, China.
So the minerals we should talk about in a minute.
Yes. That said, okay, so the picture is changing fast, right? So it is actually Chinese companies, Longji, Jia Solar, major plants in Ohio, Arizona in this case, and actually in the US, right, we went from something like 7 gigawatt of solar panel capacity, not the polysilicon, the panels,
Right.
5 years ago, to 50 gigawatts today. Current demand in the US for solar panels, around 50 gigawatts.
Yep.
So, right, no, we don't have a fully resilient supply chain onshore because the ingots and so on still come
Well,
from
the basic raw, I mean, it's assembled here, which is good.
It's assembled
But,
here.
like,
Yes,
assembled
plus
with what? They come from where?
they come from, well, turns out thanks to the Uyghur Act, for example, Forced Labor Act, right?
Right.
Not from Inner Mongolia, not from China, but from, Malaysia, Southeast Asia. Now, to be clear, this is Longji saying the US panels have all the inputs come from Southeast Asia.
Right.
So, somebody else is getting, there's leakage, right? Somebody else is getting the panels with inputs from China. That said, the US in this case, yeah, it's definitely more resilient, right? It's not like we will be able to deploy all solar panels forever without China, but right now at least, demand matches supply, panel assembly supply.
Right.
And yeah, okay, to be fair, this changed dramatically the last 3 years.
This is what I was hoping would happen.
Thanks to certain policies, right? Not the current administration, turns out in this case. And yeah, okay, so.
So let's talk about the minerals, though.
Fair enough, yes.
Because basically, so I think it's Janet Yellen coined the phrase friendshoring, or if she didn't coin it, she popularized it. And it's one of the things that I focus on in the article, because basically you think about defense externalities and you think about funding externalities. Funding externalities, the analog is Russia. You're spending $1 billion to get your energy from a country that is then using that money to attack you or other countries. And so the concern is, would China be in a position to do that if the US and Western Europe are very dependent on manufacturing, right? The other point is the raw materials are these specialized minerals. A lot of them come from Congo, for example. And in the same way that the US felt the need to defend Kuwait, would we eventually feel the need to defend Congo for parallel reasons, in which case, and I'm not saying we should or we shouldn't, I'm just saying the cost of the energy includes that component of defense spending and planning, which keeps the system working. Turns out China owns a lot of the relevant mines. They've developed a very strong position refining these minerals, and I want to give them credit. I mean, this was a very far-sighted approach where they recognized the importance to the global economy of these activities. And frankly, I think the US and Europe were a bit asleep as this happened and are now scrambling to catch up. But again, I think it would be oversimplified to say all we have to do is switch from hydrocarbons to green energy and these defense externalities and funding externalities go away. No, it's just a different set of them.
Absolutely. So, okay, so yes, and, right, so I guess there's two. So one is sort of order of magnitude.
Yeah.
Right, so it turns out, okay, so half the ships on the ocean right now shipping mostly natural gas, but fossil fuels. So yes, right, so there is a decreased dependency simply by virtue of not shipping as much stuff. So critical minerals, transition minerals, whatever we call them, are crucial, are critical.
Yep.
Orders of magnitude less, 3 orders of magnitude. 3 to 4 orders of magnitude less. So I think there's that, right? The second is, so it's not so much are these minerals available? It is, right now, the economically recoverable mine happens to be in one country and only one country. And if that's the DRC, right, which is neither democratic nor a republic, right, that's pretty darn bad.
Yeah.
So, right, what do you do now? The Tesla annual report, literally the 10K, right, has
Yes.
peace in the DRC or stability
Right.
in DRC as one of the main geopolitical risks.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one, right? Second, dependence on China is a real thing.
Yeah.
We see this right now, right? One of the responses to the
Absolutely.
Trumpian tariffs, right?
Minerals, rare earths.
Is, okay,
Yeah.
cool, we won't send you those minerals, see if you like it now, right?
Right.
And, okay, yes. Same
But
idea,
there are
right?
answers to this, right? And one of the, most of these minerals are actually present in the United States.
Yes.
So we don't mine for them now. And the question is, should we? And my answer is absolutely we should.
Duh. Oh, yes, of course. Right?
And it's interesting because what is the main reason we don't? Environmental laws. And it's tremendously ironic. And I have a dear friend on our law school faculty, Mike Gerard, who runs our Climate Change Center. And he spent the early part of his career using permitting processes to stop development. So he completely understands how those processes work. And he has been quite vocal in saying, we have to stop doing this, right? And what he has a clever phrase about it, and the phrase is, there are people on one side of the political spectrum who he worries have sort of climate denial. And then there are people on his side of the aisle who he says have trade-off denial. And the point is, they're unwilling to compromise anything. And sure, the mining is not necessarily pleasant, and it could have local environmental effects. And I mean, that's true. It's just, if you think about the potential benefits to the world of having a more robust supply of these things, it could really help. So there's ways to deal with these defense externalities. We just need to do it.
Yep. And okay, so yes, right, the regulatory simplification, sort of in the broadest sense. Permitting reform, and in many ways, well, we sort of have semi-bipartisan proposals, or had them at least. They're still out there.
Yep.
And the big question, of course, is whether now in this Congress with this president,
and maybe just so people know, because you and I know and others, but you may remember the Inflation Reduction Act. So Joe Manchin was the deciding vote in the Senate that allowed that to happen. And his terms were, I will support this if we also get permitting reform. So who knows what reconciliation is? There's the filibuster in the Senate. You need 60 votes to avoid having your debate shut down. But you can avoid it in the Senate if you're using what's called a reconciliation process, which is for budget and spending. And Harry Byrd, the senator from West Virginia, I think, was the person who kind of created this process. So the Inflation Reduction Act was passed 50-50 with Vice President Harris casting the deciding vote. You could only do it through reconciliation. They had permitting reform in it. And then the Senate parliamentarians said that's not budgeting, and that's not taxes, and it has to come out.
Yep.
So there was a moment where Manchin was sort of wondering, should I not support this? And basically, Senator Schumer said, support this, and I promise to bring it out. I promise to bring permitting reform out, and there are Republicans who support this, and hopefully we can get it passed. Did not pass. Did not pass.
And it certainly,
but it still might, right?
Yes,
at some point, it still
might, and it should.
Yeah,
to be clear.
It should.
So I didn't mean to look up a fact here to counter anything, but this is something I had to look up live because it's the live grid status of ERCOT, the Texas electricity grid.
Yeah.
So literally, right? So right now, turns out the sun is up. 30% of, and the wind is blowing. So 30% of current Texas electricity, wind, 23% solar. There's 25-ish% gas. That's a big part.
Yeah.
And then there's 10% coal and 10% nuclear. Okay, so basically if you add it up, right, it is 55-ish%, almost 60 right now.
Of electricity.
Of electricity, right? Not total energy.
Not total energy.
Electricity is currently renewable. 65% is zero carbon because nuclear is part of that too, right? And by the way, so when Texans wake up and the sun doesn't shine yet, batteries, right, used to be 0 3 years ago, now are like almost 8%, I think, this morning. I think Texans woke up pretty late today, so the sun was already shining when everyone got up. But, it's getting there'll be spring, right? So, so in a way, no, it's like 8%, right?
So, but Gernot, so how much has the increase in renewable energy reduced the consumption of carbon fuels in the world?
Very, very little.
Not really at all.
Because demand is going up.
Right.
Yes.
Right, exactly.
Now, okay, I'm not saying that you are saying this, right? But you could get the CEO of Aramco at CERAWeek in Houston, right? Oil and gas conference, more or less, to basically stand up and say, look, we've been doing this for 40 years, this being solar PV. 40 years later, we're only at 5%. This has clearly failed. And, this is literally, right, I'm paraphrasing now, but that was the CEO of Aramco like 4 weeks ago or so. At an oil and gas conference where I learned recently, if you want to be on stage with Dan Jurgen for an hour, it costs you $1.5 million.
Yes.
Okay, amazing, but okay, fine, Aramco paid that. And in an interview with Dan Jurgen, he said, this thing has failed, right? Now,
But
I don't
Dan
think you're
Jurgen
saying
didn't
that,
say- No,
right?
no, I don't think it's failed.
We're at the beginning.
Right.
And okay, so this is now paraphrasing another Economist cover. What is it? The solar something, the dawn of the solar age. And a couple of my students here are already beginning to smile because they know what's coming next. Sun, sand, and human imagination. Right, and this is sort of some sophomoric economist humor, right? And all three are limitless. And yes, okay, projection out by 2060. 85% of the world is, wind is still there. Most of it is solar. There is quite a bit of P2X, like photovoltaic to fuel, which is all solar as well. It's electrolyzes hydrogen, but, green hydrogen.
Green hydrogen.
Right, so yeah, we're at 5%. Nobody debates that, right? But, this is The Economist, right? This is not Greenpeace. This is The Economist saying by 2060, right? Not the next, not 2050, not the 1.5 degree climate goal or whatever, but yeah, close enough, 35 years from now, 85% of the world, solar, little bit of wind, some hydrogen, right? We still need liquid fuels, but again, sun, sand, and human imagination, right? Those are the ingredients.
So I think that we should certainly be looking to the long term and trying to promote the most efficient energy systems we can, which include solar and wind and nuclear. But I also want to say, I think we mustn't forget that, that 82% of global energy relying on hydrocarbons, it hasn't moved. It's not going to be easy to wean ourselves off of that. But the point I want to emphasize is that all hydrocarbons are emphatically not created equal. So what country has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions the most in the last 35 years? The United States, right? Not because of a commitment to green policies, but for something completely different. The shale revolution, natural gas became plentiful and cheap, and the substitution of natural gas for coal is a fantastic thing for climate change. And I'm not saying that it is the permanent equilibrium, but I'm saying that for now it's been great because you can get the same quantity of energy for between a half and a third of the emissions. Now, I want to be precise about this. There is a real risk with natural gas, which is that the gas itself, methane, is a very dense greenhouse gas. You don't want it floating up into the air because that's very damaging. So you've got to control the leaks. But remember, if this stuff leaks, you're losing money. It's very valuable, right? So there are commercial reasons and now stronger regulations to prevent that. But assuming you control the leaks, this is a very powerful way. So, my first goal in energy policy, if it were up to me, is nobody should be using coal anymore. 10% of energy in the United States still comes from coal. Much higher percentages in the rest of the world. China and India rely massively on coal still, including for new power plants, and this is a shame, right? And Germany, in its response to the war in Russia and Ukraine, in its effort to try to wean itself off of Russian natural gas and oil, started using a lot of coal. Fortunately, the US is now exporting natural gas to try to dissipate that. But again, there's a lot you can do within hydrocarbons to pursue environmental goals if you recognize that they're different.
Temporarily used a lot more coal in Germany, right? So I can turn up my German accent a little bit more,
right.
But so we are back down again. And to be clear, right, like phasing out nuclear, deciding in March 2011, when arguably it was understandable, not understandable to overreact and permanently lock yourself into something inferior, but that it was understandable to question reliance on nuclear at the time, right? March 11th, 2011, Fukushima. And to be clear, by March 30th, Germany basically said, we're going to phase out nuclear within 12 years.
Right.
And coal, never mind, right? We'll take until 2035 or something. Okay, fast forward to today, right? Germany has spent $500 billion, $500 billion on Energiewende, energy transition. And actually, so this is now closer to home again. Chris Wright, Energy Secretary, Natural Gas Executive. First speech as Energy Secretary, spends a third of his speech on Germany. And not in the most positive ways, right? And frankly, okay, so he's wrong about lots of things. What he was right about was Germans today are spending 3 times as much on their electricity, in his words, despite that investment. The German or Austro-American maybe response would be to say, well, yeah, some of that is intentional, and there's got to be policy reform, lots of it, and by the way, more investments, to get those prices down. By the way, Germany has been in a recession now for 2 years. Right? So no, not everything is running swimmingly, not at all. And okay, in some sense, 2 things. Look to Texas, not for, the social safety net, but energy, electricity policy. Look to other, right, liberalization, more investment, and so on. And frankly, okay, maybe the very quick Austrian example. Austria, geographic happenstance, 90% of our electricity is carbon-free. Most of it is hydro, right? It's not just ski lifts, it's also hydro dams. And the other 10%, 90% Russian gas. Right? So, guess who, by the way, what's the most profitable utility in the world? Literally the world right now.
Don't know.
Austrian Verbund. Why? All those dams were built in the 20s, 30s, 40s. So these dams are paid off. Electricity, hydro is free to produce. Who sets the price? Putin. Right, so 10x for gas prices. They're printing money. They are investing. Government forces them to invest in some renewables and so on. But okay, so what is Germany supposed to do? Well, look to Austria in some sense as a warning sign, right? Even if you're 90% renewable, you'll still depend on, right? If there's one gas plant on the grid that depends on Russian gas, well, you'll still be dependent, and every kilowatt hour in the entire country the price will depend on that last drop or cubic foot of natural gas.
I want to talk about policy in a minute.
There we go. Okay.
But first, there's a point that may be familiar to all of you and it may not be, and it's a key difference between oil on one hand and natural gas on the other. So I think you may know, United States, because of the shale technology that's been developed in the last 20 years, has gone from being major, the world's largest importer of oil, to becoming a net exporter of oil, and U.S. is the largest producer of oil in the world. We can talk about that technology and what it means. But having said that, does that mean that the U.S. is indifferent to energy shocks in the Middle East and in Russia? And the answer is no. And why not? Because if, for example, Russia invades Ukraine and Germany doesn't want to buy Russian oil anymore, what they'll do is they'll bid up the price of oil made in the US. It's a global market, and they're not quite fungible because of refining capacity, and we can talk about that, but it's pretty close. Is natural gas fungible in the same way? Not at all. Not at all, for a very simple reason. You put oil on a ship, you can send it anywhere. The most efficient way to transport natural gas is a pipeline. And you can't move a pipeline, right? So the pipeline goes from point A to point B. What you can do is you can liquefy it, which is what the US has started to do, and we've gone from, we're now the largest exporter of natural gas in the world, mostly going to Europe, mostly to try to reduce dependence on Russian gas, which was coming through pipelines. But keep in mind that a pipeline costs about twice as much. I'm sorry, liquefaction costs about twice as much as a pipeline. So therefore, there's a way in which energy shocks having to do with gas don't affect US prices nearly as much as energy shocks having to do with oil do. So there are differences in the markets. But still, I tend to think the policies that we want are sort of parallel, and we haven't been doing them, so we can talk about that.
I mean, yes, right, except increasingly because of LNG, liquefied natural gas, and then the relationship with oil markets, right? So, yeah, Putin blows a fuse on February 24th, 22, right? And, gas prices go up immediately in Europe, literally Monday morning, right? 10x.
Yeah.
And by August, there is massive inflation in this country. Hence the naming of the Inflation Reduction Act, in part, right. Due to that. And half or so of the inflation was solely due to energy prices spiking, oil and gas at the time, right? And okay, so and therefore get our fossil fuel argument is, and frankly my argument why the Inflation Reduction Act is beautifully named, not as a re-election strategy, to be clear, right? Like none of the decrease in inflation prior to November last year had anything to do with the IRA, but in the long run, right, of course, right, the only way to combat fossil inflation is to get off fossil fuels.
So I'm not a fan of the Inflation Reduction Act, although I agree with the goals. And so I want to tell everybody why. Subsidies versus taxes. And I want to be clear, like I'm going to be making the pitch for a carbon tax. I'm going to make the pitch for a national security tax. And I am mindful of the fact that politically at the moment, this seems to be a dead letter. So I just want to be open about that. But let's put the political case to one side, because I'm happy to try to make it. And I just want to explain to you folks why I think subsidies are much worse than taxes are. You might say, wait, why? Don't they both change the relative price? Isn't the idea that you have a certain price for hydrocarbons and a certain price for green energy, and you want to change the relative costs of them? Yes. And can't you do that with both a tax and a subsidy? Yes. And this is why it's sort of tempting to use the subsidy path instead of the tax path. So here's my problem with subsidies. Fundamentally, you have to pick what you want people to do, whereas with a tax, it's much more straightforward to pick what you want people not to do. So here's what I mean. Let's say we want to incentivize me to use less carbon-based energy. One thing you can do is you can say, hey, David, buy a Tesla, right? Maybe I will, right? You've got the subsidy. But is that the only way that I can reduce my carbon footprint? What if I decide to live really close to my office and I walk? What if we decide to carpool? What if I decide to
I don't know how to drive, so that's not going to work, but
yeah, I'll drive you then.
I can.
Mass transit, right? And the point is, you could, in theory, try to subsidize all of the things that people could do, and I'm just very skeptical that we could ever do it. And so what it tends to amount to with a subsidy is the critique is like the picking winners critique, where the government is saying, this is what we need to do, and we're going to put a lot of money into it. And I just don't have a lot of confidence that the government has the expertise or the incentives to get it right. Whereas if what you do instead is you say, you know what? You want to use more gasoline, you want to use more natural gas, you want to use more coal, it's going to cost you more. Then all of a sudden you're incentivizing every individual to use less, to look for alternatives, but to look for the alternatives that are appealing to them personally. And then there are businesses out there that want to serve them. So can I give one example of this? All right. So we were talking about minerals, and we were talking about the fact that you need minerals for solar panels, and you need them for wind, for the wind turbines, and you sure need them for batteries. And the challenge is that the actual, supplies of available minerals today are small relative to the potential that we would need in order to turn every internal combustion engine car into an EV, right? Over the years, could we do it? I think that there probably is enough out there to be discovered and mined. But in terms of what we have now, what we know about, not even close. which means that whatever policy that you're thinking about, you need to take that mineral constraint into account, which brings me to the difference between electric vehicles and hybrids. What is a hybrid? A hybrid has a battery. A hybrid also can run on gasoline. The Inflation Reduction Act provides a subsidy for electric vehicles, but no subsidy for hybrids. So what's the justification for that? At one level, it's sensible. If you said, I'm going to replace an internal combustion engine with an electric vehicle, that's one choice. And the other choice is, I'm going to replace an internal combustion engine with a hybrid. Well, replacing it with the EV reduces emissions by twice as much, right? So on a one-for-one comparison, it's twice as good. But here's why the one-to-one comparison doesn't work. So there's a battery in a Tesla, and there's a battery in a Toyota Camry hybrid. Are they the same size? They are not, right? The hybrid needs a small battery because it then recharges itself as you're running on gasoline, whereas there's no recharging while you're driving with that Tesla. You need a bigger one. How much bigger? Raise your hand if you think that a Tesla battery is twice as large as the battery in a Toyota Camry hybrid. Is it at least twice as large? Raise your hand.
At least, of course.
Is it at least 20 times as large? Yeah. Is it at least 50 times as large? It's 100 times. It is 100 times larger. So for a finite quantity of minerals, you can put, I guess it's 100 Toyota Camrys on the road, or you could put one Tesla on the road. And yes, that Tesla is twice as effective at reducing greenhouse gas as one Camry. But my 100 Camrys, 50 times better. Now, am I saying the government should pick a winner and it's the hybrid? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that if we had a carbon tax, this would work, right? Whereas if you have a policy where the government has to pick what it's encouraging, then you run the risk that you're not encouraging the best options.
Let's open it up to questions in a minute, but let me try to quick response. So You're not going to get an economist to argue with you against the carbon, right? So of course, right?
Yep.
Let's price the externality, get out of the way.
Right.
Now, turns out we hand out Nobel Prizes these days for the other sort of externality, the positive, learning by doing externality, right? So one of the reasons for subsidies, not just the political, not just the policy sequencing, right? First you subsidize the good in order to tax the bad, right? One real reason is, standing on the shoulders of giants is a thing, and when you tinker in your garage, you include all the money you will make from this awesome patent. What you don't internalize, not to the extent necessary, is that you're also creating shoulders for others to stand on. Right? And yeah, we need to subsidize that positive externality. And okay, so I sort of kind of made fun of Germany before. Let me try the opposite, right? So, Germany over-subsidized renewable solar PV especially from their narrow nationalistic perspective. And so did China, by the way, over-subsidized the supply side.
And Korea, my panels come from Korea.
And lots of others, yes. Okay, I would argue strongly the appropriate response for the rest of us is to brush up on our German and Chinese and Korean, right, to start writing thank you notes to those households because they subsidized climbing the learning curve, sliding down the cost curve to the rest of us. Again, arguably over-subsidized, right? Chris Wright makes fun of the German Energiewende. We benefit from the fact that they helped us climb the learning curve, right? Some of that is sort of learning by doing. The German roofer now knows which side is up and is more efficient installing the panel, right? We don't learn from that necessarily. Economies of scale, other spillovers, very much so. And yeah, right, it takes both tax and subsidy, imbalance, right? So yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act, it by the way has a fee. You must know this. What is the fee on the IRA? It's not CO2, right?
No.
It's methane.
Right.
So we have a fee, $900 per ton of
This is getting at the methane leakage point that I mentioned before.
Guess which fee is going, or which part of the Inflation Reduction Act is going to disappear? It's the methane fee, right? What is going to remain? Well, there are 2 senators from the great state of Texas who will make sure that the 45Q tax credit for removing CO2 out of thin air remains. Why?
Maybe.
Because Exxon wants it.
I mean, this is actually, and I don't mean to divert you, but since I'm one of those people who's been following President Trump's, he calls it his big, beautiful bill, very closely, the precise composition of it is interesting. And part of the challenge is it's going to be reconciliation, which means unless you get Democratic votes, which I doubt, you've got very small margins in the House in particular.
Yep.
And there are, at the moment, some people in the Republican caucus who are saying, we like some of these green subsidies and we want to keep them. There are also people in the Republican caucus saying, and this limit on state and local tax deductions of $10,000, not okay for us New Yorker Republicans and so on. But whether it actually ends up that they get their way, I think there are real
I think the latest count is sort of 20 representatives, Republican, and 4 senators by now. Not the 2 Texans, but 4 senators who are basically saying, let's use a scalpel for the IRA.
Right.
Let's not get rid of it altogether.
Right. So, and my own prediction is I think it won't all go away. I think a lot of it will go away, and probably more than those folks are saying, because there's a negotiating process where you stake out, keep this, because you really mean keep this. And so it'll be, but stay tuned. This is going to happen in the next 6 months or so. Has to happen by the end of the year, because otherwise a lot of tax cuts will expire.
Yep. Questions? Concerns? Go ahead. We have microphones. Isabel is coming with the mic. So if you just introduce yourself quickly, and just a reminder, questions end with a question mark, and they're usually 1 or 2 sentences long.
I know that. So hi, this is YY. I'm actually from CIPA, so the policy school. First year MPA, concentration climate, energy, environment. I'm from Taiwan. So I think I feel that from this this whole session, actually, the best option we have for now is gas, right? To bridge us to renewables. But for non-gas production, industrialized island country, what are the options we have from your point of view? Thank you.
So I will offer a view, and then I hope you'll correct and clarify.
I will push back on the gas, but yes, go ahead.
Okay. So look, I do think that natural gas is the best of the hydrocarbons for things we can't use renewables.
Best of the worst is to paraphrase, but okay.
But then you can't really use natural gas to power a car directly. I have a brother-in-law who works in that industry, and when I said something about this, he said, they would explode, right? So not in favor of natural gas powered vehicles, although I think in Russia they may have them. They exist in places. So then what you've got to do is you've got to use it to generate electricity, which can then be used for a battery and all the rest. So I do think that what I would be doing is saying we've got, there's a point I didn't make before, so I'll take your excellent question as an opportunity to do it. In the near term, I think we need hydrocarbons. Natural gas is part of that picture. I think oil is also part of that picture, but there's different ways to do it. Who's heard of the Willow project? Anybody heard of Willow? The Biden administration approved it towards the end of the, not that long before the election. It's up in Alaska, and it is a conventional drilling operation with a useful life of 30 years. And there's a downside to that, because maybe we won't need that oil in 30 years. So, there's a way in which you might be thinking what hydrocarbons have a kind of a naturally shorter useful life. And does anybody know what does that? Shale. Shale wells last for a year or 2, and then they're basically done, and you can run a process that revives them. But I think that if you're looking to take advantage of the hydrocarbon resources that exist, particularly in the United States, but doing it in a way that doesn't create an overhang in the future, you're going to want natural gas and you're going to want oil and gas from shale because it's more temporary.
I think I said everything I can say about natural gas, but let me, okay, sun, sand, human imagination, right? There's that, right? There is also, of course, this is Japan now as another small island nation, or a nation consisting of several small islands. Nuclear plays a large role, does now again, and as it should in many ways. There too, of course, renewables are a big, big factor, whether that is offshore wind on the one hand, wind in general, sun, solar power, and just quickly here in the US on natural gas, largest utility in this country, next era. Right, the three sort of big energy sources they are touting as sort of the ones they're investing in. Well, solar, yes. Wind, second. Gas, until very recently, was part of this list. No new gas being built by next era, no new gas. Why? There's a 3.5+ year wait on the turbines for the gas plants. It's GE and Siemens. And they can't, right? This is not we are dependent on China or tariffs are bad or anything. This is the domestic supply chain can't keep up at the moment. So right, if you want to power your, let's say, AI data center with a very, very quickly built power source, well, yeah, there is Microsoft reviving 3 Mile Island. By the way, that's not quick. Part of the equation, but also takes quite a while. What's quick? Solar, onshore wind, and yeah, you need stability, that's batteries. And you mentioned this before, just last sentence on this, right? So yes, coal is on its way out. Turns out this amazing report, coal crossover report. So this is the Energy Institute did this for the US. The 210 running coal plants in this country, for 209, it is already cheaper to replace the currently running coal plant, so the operating cost of the coal plant is more than the full-on levelized cost of electricity for local solar or local wind plus 4 hours of storage with batteries. Right? That's where we are. It's not economics, it's contracts that are keeping coal plants alive, and the global version looks very, very similar to that story.
Mm-hmm. 2 more facts that might be interesting to you guys. One is, so who knows what flaring is? Flaring. Okay, so if you look at a satellite image of the globe and you look at North Dakota, it's lit up at night. And this is basically because there are a lot of oil wells that also produce natural gas. And there isn't an infrastructure to bring that natural gas to market. So what can you do with it? There are 3 things you could do with it. One is, put it underground, which is something people are doing more, and that can deal with environmental issues. The other is just let it float up into the air. That's the worst possible thing you could do. So they burn it in order to avoid that. But the total amount of natural gas that is flared, if you took even half of it, it would power sub-Saharan Africa. It's a lot, right? It's a lot, and this is carbon emissions that we have from energy that nobody is using. So there are things you could do with that. One is to actually sort of push the building of pipelines to get them to market. Another idea is to build data centers near these wells, because then you've got power needs and a power supply which is already creating emissions but not doing anything. So, this is one thing that I think is sort of interesting. Second point is about nuclear, because I liked what you said about learning by doing. Nuclear designs going forward are so much safer than they used to be. And there's been a lot of learning about how you would never have a 3 Mile Island type situation again, or a Fukushima type problem again. So I do think that as people consider whether to take the chance on nuclear again, we should be mindful of the fact that the designs are a lot more sophisticated than they were.
A lot more sophisticated. That said, right, building the traditional 1 gigawatt large plant is now much, much more expensive
that's true.
than it used to be, largely because it's a lot of cement, a lot of steel, and yes, that is pricey. That said, doesn't mean we shouldn't invest, right? If we say learning by doing is a thing for solar PV, why shouldn't it be for another carbon-free source of electricity. Great question. Very long answer. Let's keep the answers shorter too, but go ahead. Oh, sorry, right there.
Hello.
Okay. Hi there.
Yes. Okay, it works. So my name is Darka. I actually study with YY in SIPA, and I'm from Ukraine and work specifically on the climate and security issues working together. And my question to you is, do you see any room for innovation in the critical materials substitutes? And secondly, is there any way that countries that actually have critical materials such as DRC or anybody Ukraine can make and design the system structurally to benefit from it? Yeah, thank you so much.
Excellent question. So recycling of these minerals is a good idea, and then you don't have to worry about increasing supply, you reuse them. But also the composition of your batteries can change. So if cobalt is scarce, use lithium. So I do agree. Where in Ukraine are you from? Kyiv. Oh, okay, been there many times.
Always happy to see that.
Thank you.
There was one more question right here.
Hi, my name is Trisha. I'm a green tech reporter at Morning Brew. And I just wanted to ask where geothermal fits in with kind of the three externalities: funding, defense, and then like permitting issues. And what do you think of its potential?
So I have to say I don't know as much about geothermal as I should. In theory, look, we all have access to what's going on down there. And so therefore, you could ideally take advantage of it without having to worry about what's happening in other parts of the world. But again, I think to build the necessary stuff, you need the minerals and the production. And so I think we're kind of back in parallel with what we were saying about other kinds of green technology. But you may know more.
I mean, maybe just two quick thoughts. So one is basically the sort of capabilities, supply, right? Matters a lot. So in many ways, if you're used to building, if you're used to drilling, let's say, fracking for geothermal is as easy or as difficult, for that matter, as fracking for gas. So yes, right, there's a capabilities question. And in many ways, this is why, oil and gas, this is why geothermal is now high up on the list, despite everything happening in DC, right? Because yes, there are a bunch of oil and gas companies who would like to continue their investments in the R&D in order to climb the learning curve, slide down the cost curve. Second quick point, if it still exists on the DOE website, the DOE liftoff reports are amazing on all sorts of topics. The geothermal ones, and there's two of them, are particularly prescient because, right, so the whole story is, right, the reason why they're called liftoff reports is because we are not there yet, right? There's potential, and we are not exploiting it as we speak because it's still expensive. It takes subsidies to make them cheaper. Yeah, the carbon tax helps, of course, the carbon price, amen. But it also takes investment in the R&D specifically. Geothermal in many ways is at that R&D stage. That said, your geothermal heat pump works beautifully today. Yeah. It's barely more expensive than the air heat pump. And with the right subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act, it's not any more than your gas furnace.
Those liftoff reports are still there.
Amazing. And if not, we have them in my Dropbox, so I can hook you up.
You guys know what heat pumps are? It's such a cool technology. Basically, you're sort of pulling the heat out of the air so you don't have to use as much energy to heat a place.
And right, so yes, and right, if your gas furnace is like, 80-90% efficient max, they can't get higher, right? 100 is the theoretical maximum. Your heat pump operates at 400% efficiency, no problem. Why? The extra energy comes from the air. Mm-hmm. And I think this is still true. Let me just say one more quick thing on heat pump. IKEA Switzerland sells solar panels. IKEA Sweden sells heat pumps. The thing is called Solarvarme, some made-up Swedish name, right? And it's not like you can, assemble it at your own leisure at home with, particle board, and it's not that simple. But again, right, IKEA, you get the induction plate. Right? It used to be that your $300 contractor-grade gas stove was the cheapest way to boil your water and warm up the Chinese food. Sort of all the cooking we do in student apartments in this city. Now it's the $60 induction plate from IKEA. Same technology as the $5,000 induction stove that the 3 Michelin star cooks swear by. And yes, heat pumps are being sold by not IKEA worldwide, but some, and so are solar panels. Right? I'm not saying IKEA is going to save the world, but yeah, I'm saying IKEA is going to save the world. One more question. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Aygen, a first-year MBA student from Turkey, and I've been a management consultant. So my question is regarding the externalities that we talked about. And from a Chinese perspective, it seems like they also have that, funding externality. The longer they supply the Western allies, they are like funding their future enemy maybe. But also their industry is currently too big to kind of be demanded by their base consumption at home. So they kind of have this different type of pressure. So how can the US and the Western world as we know it capitalize on this in a way that is not an all-out trade war? Thank you.
I'm going to leave that one to you. Okay, I can.
Let me
I can
go
start.
ahead. Yeah, you start.
Look, I think there's a lot that one could say about the People's Republic of China and its policies. They're still building coal-fired power plants, right? And a lot of them. And I think it's good that they've actually really started a major investment in wind in the last several years. So like there's more offshore wind being built in China than the rest of the world combined. But if you're sort of wondering what can the US and Europe do to try to deal with climate change, the answer is it's pretty limited if you don't get if you don't get India and China into that as well. Because for every ton of emissions that you reduce in Germany, there's more happening there. So I think it's a bigger question even than what you described. I would prefer a world where it's collaborative, right? And I don't believe, for example, that dealing with funding externalities means it all has to be, if you're American, made in the United States. I don't think that at all. I think the US and allies, countries that are aligned. And I can imagine a world where that would include China also. Just doesn't seem like that's been true for the last 15 years or so.
Yes, China is building coal. I might add for national security reasons, for Chinese national security reasons, right? Lots of local coal, domestic coal. Yes, that said, okay, so this is now an oil story, not an electricity story. CNOOC is predicting a peak in Chinese oil demand in a year or two. Why? More than 50% of newly registered vehicles on the road in China are electric. Not all fully electric, some are plug-in, but fully electric, I think it's like 20% and rising, part of that story. So that is clearly a big part of the picture. And then, yes, peak in Chinese emissions. The latest 5-year plan talked about 2030 peak, right? COVID recession helped and lower than expected economic growth helps, but looks like China is beating that by around 4 or 5 years or so. Why? Yes, coal plants are being built, but so are more renewables than anywhere else on the planet. Lots of things are being built in China as we speak. And with that, and maybe a quick advertisement, so I don't know all the amazing events happening here at Earth Week across Columbia campuses, but one I do know is, we spoke about nuclear a bit.
Yep.
So there is fission. There's also fusion. We have the CEO of Commonwealth Fusion here on Friday, both for a public talk at noon, 12:30, with Alexis Abramson, Dean of the Climate School, interviewing him. And if you're a Columbia Business School student, there is still a lottery for a 20-person small conversation with him beforehand, where you get to hear me again moderating a conversation. Please join us for that and many, many other Climate Week events. Thank you for joining us today on Earth Day evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Joining us here at the Business School. And enjoy the food in the back.
This was fun. Thank you.
Thank you.